Do you remember the last time you tried to get out of bed and your body simply didn't respond like before? That feeling of helplessness as your muscles, once strong and reliable, now seemed to betray you in the most everyday moments. For Manuel Sanchez, a respected university professor of 67, this reality became constant when he began to notice that each day it became harder to climb the stairs to his classroom. At first, he attributed it to the natural fatigue of age, to that wear and tear we all expect as an inevitable part of aging. But what Manuel didn't know, what none of us wants to face, is that sometimes behind that seemingly normal weakness hides a condition that can rob us not only of our strength, but of our dignity, our independence, and in exceptional cases like his, even our lives. Manuel had always been an active man. From a young age, he had combined his passion for literature with long walks through the city parks. On weekends, he used to take his grandchildren to the zoo, carrying them on his shoulders when they got tired. He was known at his university for his contagious energy, for the way he moved around the classroom while explaining the complexities of Garcia Marquez or Borges, gesturing enthusiastically as if his body were a natural extension of his words. But in recent months, something had changed. He could no longer hold a book for long without his arms trembling. He had stopped carrying his grandchildren, and his classes, once dynamic and full of movement, were now taught sitting down with a stillness that wasn't natural to him. "You're getting older, Manuel, it's normal," his colleagues would say when he mentioned his concern during lunches in the university cafeteria. "It happens to all of us," they would add, with an understanding but unconcerned smile, and Manuel wanted to believe them. He wanted to think that the weakness he felt in his thighs when climbing stairs, that tremor in his arms when pouring himself a glass of water, that fatigue that invaded him after a simple walk across campus were just normal signs of his almost 7 decades of life. But there was something more. A silent worry that grew inside him every time he noticed how his pants fit looser around his legs, or when looking in the mirror he saw that his shoulders, once broad and strong, now seemed shrunken, as if his body was slowly diminishing, fading away before his eyes. If you have identified with this story, know that you are not alone on this path. Many people like you discover daily that muscle weakness does not have to define your future. Here on the Full Life channel, we share not only real stories, but also proven paths that have helped thousands of people regain their strength and independence. Subscribe to receive our content for free, which combines the most current scientific knowledge with the sensitivity of someone who understands what you're going through. Together, we can transform this story. The first time Manuel decided to seek medical help was after an incident that left him deeply disturbed. He was teaching, explaining the meaning of magical realism, when he felt his legs giving way beneath him. It wasn't a dramatic fall. There were no screams or commotion. Simply, his muscles surrendered for an instant, forcing him to hold onto the desk to avoid collapsing in front of his students. He managed to disguise it, pretending he had bent down to pick up a pen, but the fear he felt at that moment was real and intense. It was then that he decided he could no longer ignore the signals his body was sending him. Dr. Rivera, a general practitioner from the insurance company, barely looked up from his computer while Manuel explained his symptoms. He was a young man, probably in his 30s, with the evident tiredness of someone who has attended too many patients in a single day. "Let's see, Don Manuel," he finally said, after listening to his story with apparent disinterest. "What you're describing is completely normal for someone your age. Muscles lose strength. It's part of the natural aging process." "But doctor," Manuel insisted, "it's not just weakness. It's as if my muscles were disappearing." Dr. Rivera let out a small laugh, the kind that tries to be understanding but comes across as condescending. "That's called sarcopenia, Don Manuel. It's the loss of muscle mass related to age. Nothing to worry about. Do a bit more exercise, eat more protein, and you'll see how it improves." Manuel tried to explain that he had always been active, that the weakness he felt seemed to be progressing too quickly, that something inside told him this wasn't normal. But the doctor was already writing a prescription with the haste of someone who has a full waiting room and limited time. I'm going to prescribe some vitamin supplements for you, and I recommend that you start doing resistance exercises. Nothing strenuous, just enough to keep those muscles active. And don't worry so much. At your age, it's natural to start feeling more fragile. Manuel left the consultation with a prescription in hand and a bitter taste in his mouth. He felt he hadn't been listened to, that his concerns had been dismissed with that ease with which the fears of the elderly are sometimes discarded, as if age were synonymous with hypochondria or an exaggerated sensitivity to body changes. During the following weeks, Manuel tried to follow the doctor's recommendations. He bought light weights and began doing exercises at home, following YouTube videos designed for older people. He increased his protein intake, adding more chicken and fish to his diet. He even bought the vitamin supplements, although something inside told him they wouldn't be enough to address what he was feeling. And he was right. Despite his efforts, the weakness continued to advance. Now, additionally, he had begun to notice a difficulty swallowing that he hadn't mentioned in his first consultation. Sometimes during meals, he had to make a conscious effort for food to pass down his throat, as if the muscles that controlled swallowing were also weakening. This new complication frightened him even more, leading him back to Dr. Rivera's office. This time, the doctor seemed slightly more interested, although Manuel couldn't help but notice a certain skepticism in his gaze as he described his new symptoms. The difficulty swallowing could be something completely independent of the muscle weakness, the doctor explained. It could be reflux, or perhaps some problem with the esophagus. We're going to do some basic tests, and depending on the results, we'll consider if it's necessary to refer you to a specialist. Manuel nodded, grateful for this small advance, for this minimal concession to the possibility that what he was experiencing deserved to be investigated more deeply. But while waiting in the laboratory for his blood to be drawn, he couldn't help feeling a growing frustration. Why did he have the feeling he wasn't being taken seriously? Was it because of his age? Was it because the loss of muscle strength was considered so normal in the elderly that no one was alarmed, even when the patient insisted something wasn't right? I need to ask you, and I want you to be honest with yourself. When was the last time you could openly talk about how the loss of muscle strength has affected your daily life? Perhaps you, like Manuel, have kept these concerns to yourself, thinking that no one would really understand. I understand that silence, but I want you to know that this is a space where your voice matters. If you feel comfortable, share in the comments simply by writing, "I also feel this when," and complete with your experience. Your comment might be exactly what someone needed to read today to not feel alone on this path. Sometimes, the first step to regaining our strength is simply acknowledging where we are now. Manuel's blood test results arrived 2 weeks later. Dr. Rivera reviewed them with his brow slightly furrowed, a gesture that Manuel interpreted as concern, and which, paradoxically, gave him a strange relief. At least now the doctor seemed to be taking his case more seriously. "Your creatine kinase levels are elevated," the doctor explained. "It's an enzyme that's released when there's muscle damage. There are also some other anomalies in your results that I'd like to investigate further." He paused, as if reconsidering his previous approach. "I think the best thing will be to refer you to a neurologist. The combination of progressive muscle weakness and difficulty swallowing could indicate some type of neurological problem." For the first time since he began seeking medical help, Manuel felt that someone was really listening to his concerns. However, that relief came accompanied by a new fear: neurological problems. The words resonated in his mind as he returned home, loaded with ominous implications he preferred not to explore too much. The appointment with the neurologist, Dr. Vargas, was very different from his previous experiences with Dr. Rivera. For starters, the specialist dedicated almost an hour to him, listening attentively as Manuel described the progression of his symptoms, from the first signs of weakness to the current difficulties. "Have you noticed any other symptoms besides muscle weakness and difficulty swallowing?" asked Dr. Vargas, after conducting a thorough physical examination that included testing reflexes and muscle strength. Manuel reflected for a moment. "Sometimes I feel as if my voice gets tired during my classes. Before, I could give a 2-hour lecture without problems, but now, after talking for a while, I notice that my voice becomes weaker, almost broken." The neurologist nodded, noting this new information in his file. Then he proceeded to explain to Manuel that he would need to perform some additional tests. An electromyography to evaluate the electrical function of his muscles and nerves, and a magnetic resonance imaging of his brain and spinal cord. "Do you have any idea what it could be?" asked Manuel, trying to read the doctor's expression, looking for some clue about the severity of his condition. Dr. Vargas looked at him directly, with a mixture of compassion and professional honesty. "I have some suspicions, but I prefer not to get ahead of the test results. What I can tell you is that I don't think we're dealing with a simple case of age-related sarcopenia. Your symptoms suggest something more complex, possibly a neuromuscular condition, but we need more information to reach an accurate diagnosis." The following weeks were a whirlwind of medical tests, each more exhaustive than the last. The electromyography, a procedure in which small needles were inserted into his muscles to measure electrical activity, was particularly uncomfortable. The MRI, with its confined space and thunderous noises, tested his claustrophobia. But Manuel endured each test with the determination of someone who finally feels they are moving toward answers. And the answers came, although they weren't what he expected. "The results of your tests indicate that we are dealing with a case of amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, or ALS, explained Dr. Vargas during his follow-up consultation, his voice calm but loaded with gravity. Manuel remained motionless, slowly processing what he had just heard. ALS. Even for someone without deep medical knowledge, that diagnosis had a terrible weight. It was Stephen Hawking's disease, a degenerative condition that affects motor neurons, causing progressive paralysis that eventually affects the ability to breathe. Are you sure?" he finally managed to ask, his voice barely a whisper. Dr. Vargas nodded with gravity. "The results are quite clear, although I must tell you that your case presents some unusual characteristics. The progression seems to be slower than in many typical ALS cases, and some of the markers in your blood tests are not completely consistent with the classic pattern. That's why I'd like to send you to a center specialized in neuromuscular disorders for a more detailed evaluation and a second opinion." Manuel left the consultation feeling as if the world around him had completely transformed. The buildings, the streets, the trees, everything seemed exactly the same as a few hours before, but now he saw them through a new lens, that of someone who has just received a death sentence in installments. Upon arriving home, the first thing he did was sit in front of his computer and search for information about ALS. Each page he read seemed more discouraging than the last. Relentless progression, no known cure, typical life expectancy of 3 to 5 years from diagnosis. Treatments that, at best, could only marginally slow progression or alleviate some symptoms. At some point that night, while the overwhelming information about his diagnosis accumulated in front of him, Manuel realized he was crying. They weren't tears of self-pity, but of deep frustration. Frustration for all the months when his concerns had been dismissed as simple complaints of an older man. Frustration for the lost time he could have used to prepare, to adapt, to live with the intensity of someone who knows their days are numbered. He remembered Dr. Rivera's light laugh when he mentioned he felt his muscles were disappearing. That laugh now resonated in his mind as a cruel reminder of how age can become a label that makes invisible, that normalizes suffering under the excuse that It's a natural part of aging. If the last few months had been a gradual descent into weakness, the days following the diagnosis were a nosedive into the abyss of fear and desperation. Manuel, who had always been a pillar of strength for his family, now found himself trapped in a whirlwind of emotions he had never before experienced with such intensity. The fear of what was to come, mixed with rage over what he considered a late diagnosis, and all of it bathed in a deep sadness for the dreams and plans that now seemed unattainable. It was his daughter, Elena, who finally brought him out of that state. Elena, always practical and resilient, arrived one day with a folder full of information about specialized ALS centers, experimental treatments, and support groups. "Dad," she told him firmly but with affection, "I understand that you're scared and angry. You have every right to feel that way. But we can't let fear paralyze us. We need a plan. We need options." And so, with the determination that had always characterized him in his academic life, but which had been temporarily buried under the weight of the diagnosis, Manuel began to regain some control over his situation. Together with Elena, they researched ALS specialists, finally finding a center of excellence in a nearby city that offered a multidisciplinary approach to the treatment of this complex disease. The first visit to this center was revealing. The medical team, led by Dr. Alicia Mendoza, a neurologist with more than 20 years of experience in neuromuscular disorders, conducted a comprehensive evaluation of his case. "Mr. Sanchez," explained Dr. Mendoza after reviewing all his previous results and performing some additional tests, "I agree with the ALS diagnosis, but I must tell you that your case presents some interesting peculiarities." Manuel and Elena exchanged glances. Peculiarities? What could be interesting about such a devastating disease? "The rate of progression of your symptoms is notably slower than in most cases I've seen," continued the neurologist. "Additionally, some of your biomarkers suggest that we might be dealing with an atypical variant of the disease. This is relevant because atypical variants sometimes respond differently to certain treatments and can even have a distinct clinical course." For the first time since the initial diagnosis, Manuel felt a small ray of hope piercing the darkness that enveloped him. It wasn't a promise of a cure, not even of significant remission, but it was the possibility that his path might not be exactly the same as described by all those discouraging statistics he had read on the internet. "What does that mean in practical terms, Doctor?" asked Elena, always focused on concrete aspects. "It means several things," responded Dr. Mendoza. "First, that we're going to design a personalized treatment plan, adapted to the specific characteristics of your case. Second, that you could be a suitable candidate for some clinical trials that are exploring innovative treatments for atypical ALS variants. And third, that the slower progression gives us a wider window of time to implement strategies that preserve your quality of life and functionality." The treatment plan they developed was comprehensive. Medications to slow the progression of the disease, physical therapy to maintain the functionality of muscles not yet severely affected, occupational therapy to adapt his daily activities to his changing capabilities, nutritional support to address his swallowing difficulties and maintain a healthy weight, and psychological support for him and his family. Additionally, Dr. Mendoza enrolled him in a clinical study that was evaluating a new medication specifically designed to slow progression in cases of slow-advancing ALS. It wasn't a cure, she clearly warned him, but the preliminary results were promising in terms of preserving muscle function for longer periods. If this story has impacted you, if you've found value in understanding the challenges faced by people like Manuel, I invite you to share this video with someone who might be going through a similar situation. Each time you like and share, you're helping to create awareness about the importance of taking changes in our muscle strength seriously, especially as we age. We are building a community where no one has to face these challenges alone. where each shared story is a bridge to understanding and mutual support. As the months passed, Manuel began to adapt to his new reality. There were bad days, of course, days when frustration over a new limitation plunged him into sadness. But there were also good days, days when he marveled at the capabilities he still retained, at the small victories he achieved in his therapy, at the incredible support network he had found both in the medical field and in his personal circle. One of the most difficult decisions was when he had to inform the university about his condition. He feared they would force him to retire early, that they would remove him from the teaching that had been the center of his life for more than 4 decades. To his surprise, the response was more understanding than he expected. Manuel, the rector, an old colleague and friend, told him, "Your value to this institution goes far beyond your ability to stand in front of a classroom. Your knowledge, your experience, your passion for literature, that's what your students need. We will find a way to adapt to your changing needs." And so they did. They assigned him accessible classrooms on the ground floor. They provided him with an assistant for administrative tasks that required more physical effort. They adapted his schedule to allow for more frequent breaks. And when the weakness in his arms made it difficult to handle heavy books, they provided digital versions that he could navigate with voice commands on a tablet. His students, far from distancing themselves or feeling uncomfortable about his condition, showed surprising empathy and adaptability. When his voice began to weaken after speaking for long periods, a student suggested using a small microphone and amplifier. When they noticed he got tired of sitting in the same position, they spontaneously organized brief pauses during classes, moments when they discussed among themselves what they had learned while the professor repositioned himself or took a short break. At home, Elena and the rest of the family made similar adaptations. They installed support bars in strategic places. They rearranged the furniture to facilitate the passage of the wheelchair, which, although he didn't yet need it permanently, they knew would eventually be necessary. They adapted the kitchen so Manuel could continue preparing his famous Sunday paellas, a family tradition he refused to abandon despite his growing limitations. One of the most significant moments in this new chapter of his life occurred 6 months after the diagnosis, during a meeting of the ALS support group he had joined at his psychologist's insistence. Until that moment, Manuel had religiously attended the weekly meetings, but always as a silent observer, listening to others' stories, learning from their experiences, but sharing little of himself. That night, however, something changed. The topic of discussion was how to maintain identity and purpose despite growing physical limitations. After listening to several testimonials, Manuel finally raised his slightly trembling hand. "For months I have felt trapped between 2 narratives," he began, his voice weaker than before but still loaded with the eloquence that had distinguished him as a professor. "On one hand, there is the medical narrative, cold and statistical, that defines me by my diagnosis, by my limitations, by the inevitable progression of my disease. On the other hand, there is the narrative of denial, equally dangerous, that whispers to me that if I try hard enough, if I have the right attitude, I can somehow overcome this condition with pure willpower." He paused, taking a sip of water to relieve the dryness in his throat, a side effect of one of his medications. "But I think I've found a third narrative, one that allows me to accept the reality of my condition without being completely defined by it. In this narrative, my ALS is a character in the story of my life, a formidable antagonist, yes, but not the protagonist. The protagonist is still me, with my passions, my relationships, my contributions, my essence that goes beyond my physical body." Manuel's words resonated deeply with everyone present. Many nodded with tears in their eyes, recognizing in his reflection something they themselves had felt, but had not been able to articulate in that way. "My body is progressively failing," he continued, "and there's no way to ignore that reality. Every day, There's something new I can no longer do, or can only do with help. But I've discovered that there is a crucial difference between what I am and what I can do. What I can do is diminishing, that's true. But what I am, that remains intact. That night marked a turning point in his way of facing the disease. He was no longer just a passive recipient of treatments and adaptations. He had become an active participant in shaping his experience, in constructing meaning from his new reality. In the following months, this transformative perspective led him to make some important decisions. The first was to begin writing his memoirs, not as an exercise in nostalgia or an early farewell, but as a way to reclaim the narrative of his life on his own terms. With the help of voice recognition software that allowed him to dictate when his hands were too tired to write, he began to capture not only his memories and reflections, but also his current experiences living with ALS. The second decision was even more significant. Inspired by Dr. Mendoza, who had explained to him the importance of research to advance the understanding and treatment of diseases like his, Manuel decided that when the time came, he would donate his body to science. Specifically, he had signed a consent for his neural tissues to be studied after his death as part of a research project focused on atypical variants of ALS. Perhaps my particular case, with its unusual characteristics, can offer some clue that helps researchers better understand this disease, he explained to Elena when he communicated his decision to her. It won't change my fate, but it could contribute to changing that of others in the future. This decision brought with it a kind of peace, a sense of purpose that transcended the limits of his own life. The idea that even after his death, his body, that same body that now betrayed him, could contribute to the advancement of scientific knowledge, provided him with unexpected consolation. Meanwhile, the experimental treatment in which he was participating seemed to be having a positive effect. The progression of his symptoms, which was already slower than average, seemed to have slowed even more. It wasn't a complete halt, much less a reversal, but each month without significant deterioration was a victory. The results are promising, Dr. Mendoza explained to him during one of his follow-up consultations, but we must maintain realistic expectations. ALS remains a degenerative disease for which we have no cure. What we're seeing is a deceleration of the progression, not a halt. Manuel nodded, appreciating the neurologist's honesty. Throughout this process, he had learned to value clear and compassionate truth above false hopes. How much time? He asked, a question he had avoided asking until now. Dr. Mendoza looked at him directly, respecting him enough not to evade the question. Based on the current rate of progression and your response to treatment, I'd say we could be talking about several more years of reasonable quality of life. But Manuel, if I've learned anything in my career, it's that each patient is unique. I've seen cases that exceed all expectations and others that don't. What I can promise you is that whatever path your disease takes, you won't walk it alone. 2 years after the diagnosis, Manuel's life had changed in ways he could never have imagined, but not all were negative. Yes, he now depended on a motorized wheelchair for most of his movements. Yes, he needed help for tasks he used to perform without thinking. Yes, there were days when frustration and fear threatened to plunge him into despair, but he had also discovered new depths in his relationships. The bond with Elena had strengthened in ways neither of them would have thought possible. His grandchildren, far from distancing themselves because of his condition, had developed surprising sensitivity and empathy. Lucas, the oldest, barely 12, had learned to adjust his grandfather's wheelchair position without being asked, intuiting when he needed a change to be more comfortable. Sophia, the little 8-year-old, had turned Manuel's exercise sessions into a game, counting aloud while he tried to move his fingers or flex his wrists, celebrating each small achievement as if it were an Olympic victory. His perspective on teaching had also evolved. Before the diagnosis, Manuel had been the type of professor who prided himself on his independence, on his ability to control every aspect of his class. Now, he had learned to co-create the educational space with his students, to depend on them for certain tasks, to accept their help, not as a sign of weakness, but as an expression of mutual respect. Interdependence, he often explained in his classes when discussing topics related to the human condition in literature, is not the opposite of independence. It's its natural evolution. It's recognizing that we all are, at different times and in different ways, both givers and receivers of care. One spring afternoon, as Manuel was sitting in his garden, watching Elena plant new flowers, an idea began to form in his mind. An idea that had been germinating for months, nourished by his reflections on his own case and conversations with other patients in the support group. "What if I write a book?" he asked Elena, when she approached to offer him a glass of lemonade. "Not just my memoirs, but something more specific, a book about how doctors listen, or sometimes don't listen, to their elderly patients." Elena looked at him with interest, wiping the dirt from her hands on her gardening apron. "Are you thinking about Dr. Rivera?" Manuel nodded. "About him and so many others. I've been talking with people in my support group, and it seems to be a common pattern. Symptoms dismissed as age things, concerns ignored, delayed diagnoses. And it's not just with ALS. It happens with many conditions, including sarcopenia." "Sarcopenia?" asked Elena, sitting next to him. "Yes, that age-related loss of muscle mass that Dr. Rivera mentioned. It's real, and it affects many older people. But that's precisely the problem. Because it's common and associated with aging, it's sometimes used as an easy explanation to dismiss symptoms that could indicate more serious problems." Sarcopenia, Manuel had learned in his research, was a legitimate condition that affected millions of older people worldwide. Characterized by the progressive loss of muscle mass and strength related to age, it could have a significant impact on quality of life, increasing the risk of falls, fractures, disability, and dependence. But he had also learned that there were effective interventions, specific exercise programs, nutritional adjustments, certain supplements that, when implemented in time, could significantly slow this muscle loss or even partially reverse it. The problem was that, for both patients and some doctors, muscle weakness was simply considered an inevitable part of aging, something to be accepted rather than actively treated. This resignation, this normalization of physical deterioration in old age, could not only lead to ignoring more serious conditions, as had happened in his case, but also prevented many older people from receiving proper attention for sarcopenia itself. During the following months, Manuel divided his time between his classes, his treatment, and this new project. With the help of Elena and a graduate student who acted as his research assistant, he began to collect stories, review medical literature, interview specialists in geriatrics and neurology. The process was not without challenges. There were days when the fatigue was overwhelming, when his hands could barely control the adapted keyboard, when his voice weakened to almost disappearing after an hour of dictation. But he persisted, driven by the conviction that this story needed to be told. "The hardest thing about aging," he wrote in one of the chapters of his book, "is not the physical deterioration itself, but the way this deterioration can erode our voice and our agency. The way, subtly, the world begins to talk to us instead of talking with us, to decide for us instead of deciding with us, to look through us instead of at us." The manuscript grew slowly, nourished by his personal experience but expanding far beyond it. He included an entire chapter dedicated to sarcopenia, explaining in accessible terms what it was, how it was diagnosed, and most importantly, how it could be proactively addressed. "Sarcopenia is not a sentence," he wrote. "It is a condition that, like many aspects of aging, responds to proper care. Our muscles, even in old age, maintain a surprising capacity for adaptation. They can strengthen, they can recover, they can serve us better if we give them what they need. As his book took shape, so did a complementary idea. Manuel had begun to imagine a program at his university, a series of workshops aimed at both medical students and practicing doctors, focused on effective communication with older patients. It's not just about having the correct information, he explained to the dean of the medical school when he presented his proposal. It's about challenging the unconscious biases we all have about aging, about learning to see the person behind the age, to listen actively, even when what we hear seems, on the surface, a common complaint. To his surprise and delight, the proposal was received with enthusiasm. The dean, a physician with decades of clinical experience before dedicating herself to academic administration, had observed the same problem throughout her career. "You know, Manuel," she confided during one of their planning meetings, "doctors receive years of training on pathologies, treatments, procedures, but very little on how to really listen to a patient, especially when that patient belongs to a group that we tend to see through the lens of our own prejudices." The first workshop was scheduled for the fall semester, which gave Manuel enough time to finish his book and prepare the material. Despite his condition continuing to progress slowly, his mind remained as sharp as ever, and his determination only seemed to strengthen with each new physical challenge. It was during this period that something unexpected happened. Dr. Rivera, the general practitioner who had initially dismissed his symptoms, contacted him after hearing about his book through a common colleague. The meeting was initially awkward. Manuel hadn't seen the doctor since those first consultations before the ALS diagnosis. Now, sitting in his wheelchair in the cafe where they had agreed to meet, he observed how the physician recognized him, how his eyes registered the evident changes in his physical condition. "Professor Sanchez," the doctor greeted him, extending his hand with a mixture of professionalism and evident discomfort. "Thank you for agreeing to see me." Manuel shook his hand, noting that the physician carefully adjusted the pressure of his handshake, aware of his muscle weakness. "Dr. Rivera, it's been a while." A brief silence settled between them, loaded with the weight of the unspoken. It was the doctor who finally broke it. "I've heard you're writing a book about the experience of older patients in the healthcare system, and I also learned about your diagnosis. I wanted to talk to you about that." Manuel nodded, inviting him to continue. "First, I want to apologize," said Dr. Rivera, looking him directly in the eyes for the first time. "I reviewed your file after finding out. I remembered our consultations, and I realized that I didn't really listen to you. I interpreted your symptoms through my own assumptions about age." The honesty of the apology surprised Manuel. He had imagined this encounter many times, but always expecting defensiveness, justifications, perhaps even denial. "May I ask why you wanted to talk to me?" inquired Manuel, genuinely curious. Dr. Rivera sighed. "Because your case made me question my practice. It made me realize that I might be overlooking important things in other patients, especially older ones. And because I want to learn to do better." That conversation marked the beginning of an unexpected collaboration. Dr. Rivera offered to review the chapters of his book related to the medical perspective, contributing ideas from the other side of the equation. He also committed to being one of the facilitators in the workshops Manuel was organizing, openly sharing his experience as an example of how unconscious biases can affect clinical judgment. "I can't change what happened in your case," he told him in one of their work meetings, "but I can use that experience to help other doctors not make the same mistake." The story we shared today is just one among many journeys of transformation we have witnessed. We recognize your courage in seeking solutions, even when the path seems difficult. If you wish to regain not only your physical strength, but also the confidence and independence that sarcopenia can diminish, we invite you to join our community. subscribe to the channel, share your story in the comments, and allow us to walk beside you on this journey. The strength you seek already exists within you. We're here only to help you rediscover it. Until the next video, take care of yourself with the love you deserve. Manuel's book, titled Listen to Me, Voices of the Elderly in the Medical Labyrinth, was published 3 years after his initial diagnosis. It combined rigorous research, personal testimonies, and deep reflections on aging, illness, and human dignity. An entire chapter was dedicated to sarcopenia, explaining not only its medical aspects, but also how this very common condition often served as an excuse to normalize symptoms that deserved deeper investigation. The reception was surprisingly enthusiastic. Reviews in medical journals praised its balance between scientific rigor and accessibility. Elder rights advocacy groups adopted it as an educational tool. Medical schools began including it in their programs on medical ethics and patient communication. But perhaps the greatest impact of the book was at the individual level, in the countless letters and emails that Manuel began to receive from readers across the country. Older people who felt validated seeing their experiences reflected in his words. Doctors who recognized patterns in their own practice and committed to changing them. Family members who had found in the book the tools to better advocate for their loved ones in medical settings. The workshops he had developed along with the medical faculty were also having a significant impact. The practical approach, which included role-playing exercises where medical students experienced what it was like to be an older patient whose concerns were dismissed, was changing perspectives and challenging deeply rooted assumptions. Dr. Rivera, true to his word, had become one of the most effective facilitators, openly sharing how his own biases had affected his clinical judgment in Manuel's case and in others. His honesty and vulnerability created a space where other doctors felt safe to examine their own practices without defensiveness. On a personal level, Manuel's condition continued to progress, although more slowly than they had initially feared. 4 years after the diagnosis, he needed assistance for most daily activities. His voice had weakened considerably, forcing him to use a voice synthesizer to communicate for extended periods. His hands, once agile for writing on the blackboard or gesturing during his classes, now could barely hold an adapted fork. But his mind remained as bright as ever, and his spirit, far from weakening, seemed to strengthen with each new challenge. He had found a way to live fully within the limits of his condition, to continue contributing significantly to his field and to society. "ALS may be consuming my body," he told Elena during the celebration of his 71st birthday, using the voice synthesizer that was now an extension of himself. "But it cannot touch what really matters. It cannot touch my capacity to love, to think, to connect, to contribute." In an unexpected twist of fate, it was precisely his condition that led him to one of the most significant projects of his career. A young neurologist from the center where he received treatment, impressed by his book and educational work, proposed that he collaborate on a research study focused on patients with atypical ALS variants like his. "Your perspective as a patient and as an educator would be invaluable," explained Dr. Martina Costa. "We want to better understand not only the biomedical aspects of these variants, but also the lived experience of patients, how they navigate the healthcare system, how they adapt their lives to the progression of the disease." Manuel accepted without hesitation. During the following months, he worked closely with the research team, contributing ideas for the study design, reviewing materials to ensure they were accessible and respectful, and finally, participating himself as a research subject. The study turned out to be pioneering in several aspects. Not only did it contribute to scientific knowledge about atypical ALS variants, but it also established a new model for medical research, one in which patients were active collaborators rather than mere study subjects. When the preliminary results were published in a prestigious medical journal, Manuel's name appeared as a co-author, an unusual recognition for someone without formal medical training. The article not only presented significant clinical findings, but also included a section on the importance of doctor-patient communication in the early diagnosis and management of neurodegenerative conditions. In one of the study's follow-up meetings, Dr. Acosta shared exciting news. Based partially on the data collected, a team of researchers in collaboration with a pharmaceutical company was developing a new medication specifically designed for slow-progression ALS variants. "We're years away from having something approved for clinical use," warned the neurologist, always careful not to create false hopes. "But the laboratory results are promising. And the important thing is that this approach would never have been developed if we hadn't paid specific attention to cases like yours, which don't follow the typical pattern of the disease." Manuel nodded, aware that he would probably not live to see this treatment available to patients. But he felt a deep satisfaction in knowing that his case, his story, was contributing to a future where others might have better options. 5 years after that day when Dr. Rivera had laughed lightly at his concern about muscle loss, Manuel found himself in a situation he never would have imagined. His body was significantly weakened by ALS, depending on a motorized wheelchair for mobility and on assistance for many basic tasks. But his life was full of purpose, of meaningful connections, of valuable contributions. His book was now in its 3rd edition, expanded with a new chapter about his participation in medical research. The workshops he had initiated had expanded to other universities, creating a national network of educators committed to improving communication between doctors and elderly patients. And his case, meticulously documented by the research team, was helping scientists better understand atypical ALS variants and develop more specific treatments. One afternoon, while reviewing correspondence with Eleanor's help, he found a particularly moving letter. It was from a young doctor who had attended one of his first workshops and now worked in a geriatric clinic. "I want you to know," the doctor wrote, "that there is a patient alive today thanks to you. An 82-year-old woman came to my office with complaints of muscle weakness. Before your workshop, I probably would have attributed her symptoms to age-related sarcopenia and recommended basic exercises. But I remembered your story, how your symptoms were initially dismissed. So I ordered additional tests that revealed a treatable heart problem that was causing the weakness. After proper intervention, she has regained much of her strength and vitality." This, thought Manuel as Elena read him the letter, this is what matters. Not how long we live, but how many lives we touch during the time we have. At that moment, looking out the window toward the garden where Elena had planted those flowers years ago, now in full bloom, Manuel felt a deep peace. His body might be failing, but what he had sown would continue to flourish long after he was gone. Sarcopenia, that condition which Dr. Rivera had mentioned almost casually as an explanation for his symptoms, had become a focal point of his educational work, not because it was the cause of his weakness, as had been erroneously suggested initially, but because it perfectly represented how age-related changes were often normalized without adequate investigation. Sarcopenia is real, he always explained in his workshops and in his book. It's a serious condition that affects the quality of life of millions of older people, and it deserves appropriate medical attention, effective interventions, ongoing research. But it should never be used as a convenient explanation to dismiss symptoms that might indicate more serious problems. This message, seemingly simple but deeply important, was changing medical practices, saving lives, improving the quality of life of countless older people. And it had all begun with a misdiagnosis, with a light laugh that dismissed legitimate concerns, with a doctor who saw the age before seeing the patient. Manuel's story was not a story of triumph over disease in the traditional sense. ALS continued to advance, relentless though slow, but it was a story of triumph in a deeper and more meaningful sense. It was the story of a man who had transformed his own suffering into a catalyst for change, who had found purpose in pain, who had converted a devastating diagnosis into an opportunity to serve others. And perhaps most importantly, it was a story that would continue to unfold long after he was no longer present to tell it. In the doctors who practiced differently because of his teachings, in the patients who received better care because of his advocacy, in the medical research that benefited from his voluntary participation, in the older people who found their voice inspired by his example. In the end, the condescending laugh of the doctor who didn't see beyond his age had become the seed of a legacy that would far transcend his physical life. A legacy of active listening, of respect for the wisdom of the elderly, of truly patient-centered healthcare. Manuel's life would continue for some time more, each day a gift, each contribution an act of defiance against the disease that slowly consumed his body but could never touch his spirit. And when the time finally came to depart, he would do so with the serene certainty that his story had changed other stories, that his voice had amplified other voices, that his struggle had eased the path for others. Because in the end, isn't that what we all desire? Not simply to live, but to live in such a way that our existence leaves the world a little better than we found it. Not simply to be remembered, but to be remembered for the difference we made in the lives of others. Manuel Sanchez, the literature professor, who became an unlikely agent of change in the field of medicine, had achieved precisely that. And in that achievement, he had found not only meaning, but also a kind of immortality, one that no disease, not even one as relentless as ALS, could ever take away. The next time you see an older person struggling with muscle weakness, remember this story. Remember that behind what might seem simply age things, there might be a treatable condition, or in exceptional cases like Manuel's, something more serious that requires immediate medical attention. Remember that sarcopenia is real and deserves attention, but should never be an excuse to dismiss legitimate concerns. And above all, remember that each older person deserves to be heard, respected, and treated with the dignity that corresponds to a life of experience and wisdom. This is the lesson Manuel wanted to leave us. A lesson that, as his students could attest, he taught until the end, with the same passion and eloquence he once used to bring the great classics of literature to life in his university classrooms. Next, we have two incredible stories waiting for you. Just click on the image you want to see, and it will start playing.